I'd like to introduce Joan Ritzie, a current member of the Society's board, a former president of the Society, and a recently retired head of the Center for Newfoundland and Labrador Studies, who will now say a few words about Gilbert Higgins, for whom we dedicate this lecture. Joan?
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. Tonight, the Association of Newfoundland and Labrador Archives, the Museum Association of Newfoundland and Labrador, and the Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society are hosting the annual Gilbert Higgins Lecture. Since 2009, the three organizations have been remembering Gilbert's lifelong service to the preservation of culture, heritage, and history in Newfoundland and Labrador by inviting a notable person of the place to speak on a matter of history. Gilbert was an astounding volunteer for the Bay St. George area, the Historic Trust, and for the three associations I've already mentioned. He was a founding member of the Archives Association, and he was the first president of the Museums Association. As a child, he joined the Historical Society, and he never left. While living in Stephenville, he was chair of the Port-au-Port Bay St. George Heritage Association. And in his earlier life, he had a career as an officer in the military, and then later gave a great deal of his time to the cadet movement. In 1988, the Historical Society presented him with a Heritage Award for the broad range of his contributions. Aside from volunteering, Gilbert also had a working life. He was a prominent historian, teacher, public librarian, and archivist. And in his private life, he was an avid collector of maps, papers, files, letters, and books relating to our history. All this serious work shows how successful and prominent Gilbert was, but doesn't really bring out how famous he was as being delightful and eccentric. Luckily, some of Gilbert's personality is preserved in a 1990s Land and Sea television program, wherein Gilbert gives the CBC interviewer a walking tour of the town of Stephenville while he was wearing his dressing gown, and he shows off his document-filled home and demonstrates how clever he was to use the shelves of his oven as extra book storage space. So we hope you enjoy tonight's lecture and that these lectures serve as a memorial to Gilbert's idea of what makes a great evening. Thank you. Over to you, John.
Okay, thank you, Joan. That was a wonderful presentation on Gilbert. Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce Earl now, and to many of you, he doesn't need any introduction, but I remember Earl. We were at university together in the late 60s and early 70s, and Earl is a graduate from Memorial University with the BA honors, I believe in mathematics, as I recall, in 1972. He worked for 4 years in the newsroom of what was then known as the Evening Telegram before he moved to the FFAW, where he worked for 37 years, including 21 years as president. He was elected leader of the Provincial New Democratic Party in 2015, leading the party in the 2015 election. He retired from that position in 2017. By the way, Boulder Books is offering a 10% discount to any members of the audience who buy Earl's recently published book, A Match to a Blasty Bough, How FFAW-Unifor Confronted Power and Shared the Wealth. You can buy the book with the discount between tonight and November 30th, 2022 using the coupon code FISHERY, and the publisher's website is www.boulderbooks.ca. I've almost finished the book myself. It's a lively and compelling read. Earl's ability to summarize economically critical fisheries issues is extraordinary. The focus of each chapter is sharp and to the point. So I now pass the evening over to Earl McCurdy and his presentation, A History of the Fish, Food, and Allied Workers, FFAW uniform. Earl, we look forward to what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, John, for those kind words and for the invitation to present here tonight. It's certainly an honor to deliver the Gilbert Higgins lecture, particularly having heard of his, from Joan, of his kind of remarkable career. In 1911, in his publication, Historical Geography of Newfoundland, J.D. Rogers said, "Codfish, alive or dead, wet or dry, have exercised an all-pervading influence over the destiny of Newfoundland." It was codfish, in fact, that brought Europeans to Newfoundland in the first place and that dictated the patterns of settlement. By the mid-19th century, Newfoundland was the world's largest exporter of salt codfish, and towards the end of that century, more than 90% of the male workforce worked in fishery-related work. The circumstances of those who engaged in the fishery were tough. Sidney Knoll, in his book Politics in Newfoundland, gives a pretty thorough example of the kind of life that people who fish for a living faced in those days. When he wrote, "With the decline of the English West Country influence, virtually the entire export and import trade of the country, i.e. Newfoundland, had fallen into the hands of a small group of St. John's merchants who, with the government officials, churchmen, and others they supported, formed the dominant social class. Not only were they wealthy, they were also immensely powerful, for the financial structure of the fishery had become totally dependent upon their capital. A middle class of small traders and artisans was numerically insignificant. The lower class, which included the vast majority of the population, consisted almost entirely of fishermen. Over this class, the merchants held practically unlimited power based upon the truck system of credit trading. Under it, the merchant set both the price of the goods he supplied to the fishermen on credit and the price of the fish he accepted in payment of the debts. In consequence, the use of cash was practically eliminated from the transaction. One bad season could place the fisherman hopelessly in debt, and by refusing him further credit, the merchant had it in his power to destroy a fisherman's livelihood. Starting in 1908, the Fishermen's Protective Union, led by Sir William Coker, had a strong run aimed at doing something about that. And I believe the society had a description of that in a lecture some time ago by Bill Blasty. So I won't get into any of the details there, other than to note that ruinous post-World War I market conditions really were the undoing of Coker's ambitious fisheries reforms. And by the early 1920s, the FPU was largely a spent force. On the processing side, on the other hand, their organizational structure fared a bit better. In his book, The Story of Newfoundland, A.B. Perlin described the founding in 1936 of the Newfoundland Salt Codfish Fishery Association, which was formed for the express purpose of influencing policy with the Fisheries Commission, which ran the Fisheries Board, rather, which ran the fishery during commission of government. At the time of Confederation, that association took on producers of canned fish, seal products, and so on, and reconstituted itself as the Newfoundland Fish Trades Association, later known as FFAW. Fishermen had no counterbalancing organization in terms of influence or power. The Labor Relations Act, introduced by the new Smallwood government, did not provide for collective bargaining rights for fish harvesters. So in other words, not much had changed from the circumstances Knoll had described from the 19th century right up to not only for Confederation, but for the next 20 years thereafter. All of which is by way of background for the slice of history I'm here to talk about tonight, which is the first 50 years of the province's fisheries union, now known as FFAW-Unifor. A preliminary step in the formation of this union took place on the Northern Peninsula with the formation of the Northern Fishermen's Union in 1970. It involved the plant workers in Port-au-Soir as well as fishermen in the surrounding area. A year later, the founding convention of the Newfoundland Fishermen, Food and Allied Workers Union was held, which also included a number of previously organized fish plants. That union was formed into three sectors, industrial, deep sea, and inshore, and Richard Cashin was elected the founding president. The first task for the fledgling union was to lobby for collective bargaining rights for inshore fishermen, and that's something they're successful at within a couple of months. By May of that year, the Fishing Industry Collective Bargaining Act had been proclaimed. So the task of improving the sharing of wealth of the fishery, reshaping the power structure, and revitalizing the economy of coastal communities was well underway, with two fundamental building blocks, the union and the collective bargaining legislation, firmly in place. The events of the ensuing 50 years are what prompted me to write the book that John has described, A Match to a Blasty Bough. And I'd like to thank Boulder Books for their confidence in me in publishing the book. And there was time to coincide with the union's 50th anniversary. I'd just like to briefly, I'm sure some historians be interested, just describe how I went about researching the book. Some of it, of course, came because first of all, I wouldn't pretend that it was some kind of an independent documentation by a third party or some kind of an academic treatise, because it wasn't. I had a horse in that race, but it wasn't exactly a memoir either, because it involved the input from a lot more people apart from myself. But I started with first of all, my own recollections, handwritten notes, which I kept prodigiously, source documents, newspaper clippings, and I did interviews with more than 50 people who had, who were actively involved in some aspect or other of the activities described in the book. Most as rank and file members of the union, some in elected leadership positions. So those were the kind of the inputs, I guess, into putting the book together. Now, obviously, all the activities that happened over 50 years are beyond what you can cover in a single lecture. You'd be glad to hear. So I thought I'd zero in on a couple of key areas, because really, in the time available, that's about all I can do. But I'd like to start with the early years, because they were so crucial. Survival was far from guaranteed. In fact, when the companies got a little concerned at the beginning, they met with Premier Smallwood to say they were a little worried about what was going on, and Smallwood apparently told them, "Don't worry about Cashin. In 6 months he'll be doing something else." Well, Joey was off by about 22 years, but in any event, the union did get up and running, and one of its first undertakings was to sign union cards in the isolated South Coast community of Burgeo. And they sure picked a tough challenge in picking Burgeo. It was a one-man town. That one man was Spencer Lake. He owned the plant, the fish plant. He owned pretty well all the businesses in town. He was a mayor, and essentially what he said went. In an interview with I think it was the Evening Telegram, but with news media in any event, he made it clear he would never agree to a closed shop union. And he went on to say, in these isolated outports, I contend there is no place for a union. I'm not anti-union. I just think that in certain circumstances, unions are not practical. And this is one of them, isolated outports in Newfoundland. You haven't got the local leadership to run them intelligently. With all due respect to the people, I'm very fond of them. The union, in response to that, was left with no alternative but to go on strike, and the ensuing conflict was epic. The union tried all kinds of tactics, a floating picket line in the harbor. They sent a small delegation to Gloucester, Massachusetts, where Lake had an operation and picketed there, where they had support of the stevedores who unloaded the lake boats at the company's premises there. But they also came up against a court injunction, severely limiting picketing. Inevitably, they got to the point where they concluded that the only way that they could succeed in this strike, injunction or no injunction, was to stop production in the plant, which had been going on with strikebreakers. So on October the 17th, 1971, more than 100 union members barreled in through the plant and also went around the town, and some damage to Lake businesses ensued. He announced from Massachusetts that he was resigning as mayor and that the plant would never open again. In the lead up to these activities, one of the people I interviewed said that the strike turned brother against brother, wife against husband, and father against son. Another man told me Burgeo was a pretty dangerous place for a while. But in any event, after Lake left, the provincial government nationalized the plant. A collective agreement was negotiated pretty quickly, and the government engaged National Sea Products from Nova Scotia, to operate the plant, and eventually National Sea bought it with the government's interest. And the union had passed its first major test. Failure in Burgeo would have been disastrous, and they in fact didn't fail. They succeeded, and they had a collective agreement and something to build on, which they then took to other locations. In 1973, there was a breakthrough plant agreement at BC Packers in Harbour Breton that saw wages increase from the base rate in the plant from $1.75 to $3 an hour over the life of the agreement, plus numerous other benefits and improvements in contract language. That, by any standard, is a massive improvement in collective agreement. And then once that agreement was negotiated, that pattern became the norm in other fish plants. The next major test occurred in 1974, starting on July the 1st. When inshore harvesters on the Northern Peninsula went on strike after negotiations on fish prices had gone nowhere. After a few weeks of continuing to go nowhere, staff representative Bill Short took a few of the Northern Peninsula men to Burin to meet with trawlermen who tied up their boats in support. And then, in the words of Chess Cribb, who was one of the leaders of the trawlermen over the years, we got into our own issues: the co-adventurer system, no rights, no pay. The co-adventurer system, some of you may recall, was a kind of inappropriate name for the arrangement that existed between trawlermen and the trawler companies, in that it kind of implied a partnership or an equality that didn't really exist, because the company, the skipper called the shots. He decided where to fish, what species to fish, and the trawlerman got paid only if his fishing plan produced results. The inshore prices were eventually settled, but the trawler strike dragged on and spread to other companies. Eventually, even the provincial governments set up and took notice. And they eventually, Premier Morris committed to a conciliation board with broad terms of reference to include looking not only at the financial capacity of the companies to pay for fish, but also at what was referred to as the social needs of trawlermen, i.e. their need for a decent income. The boats resumed fishing, or the trawlermen resumed fishing, while that report was being put together. Dr. Leslie Harris, who went on to become the chair of the Harris Report into the Northern Cod, and also, of course, the president of Memorial University, chaired that board, and the report made 13 recommendations. The union accepted all of them. The companies accepted all, but the most important one, which is that trawlermen be reimbursed on the basis of income levels rather than on a share of the landed catch. During the traditional Christmas tie-up that fall, or that winter, trawlermen voted by a rather remarkable 450 to 5 to remain tied up after Christmas. So after several more weeks on strike, Frank Moores got involved, met with the parties, and then he contacted the president of the Canadian Labour Congress, Joe Morris, to seek his help. Morris assisted in negotiations that started in Ottawa, shifted to St. John's, went back to Ottawa, and ultimately a settlement was reached, which included a guaranteed wage of $20 a day, plus a share of the value of fish landings. Now, $20 a day might not seem like much today, but I can tell you in those days for the trawlerman, that was seen as quite a victory. And I think it's fair to say it was widely regarded as a major win by the union and a fundamental change in the status of trawlermen. Now, all this occurred during a downturn in fisheries markets. And the settlement was only made possible by the provision of financial assistance by the federal government. Now, it had long been a burr on Richard Cashin's saddle that whenever financial assistance was paid, as it was intermittently in the fishery over the years, it always went to the fish companies and never to the primary producers, the fish harvesters. So he, once the trawler strike is settled, of course, the union had gotten a pretty prominent role, and he pushed very hard with the federal government to have a comparable level of payments made to inshore fishermen. And on this, he was successful. And the government agreed to pay 2.5 cents a pound on ground fish and a comparable amount on crab to fishermen, not only in this province, but throughout Atlantic Canada. So I think this issue, as much as any, highlights just how important a decision it was at the very beginning when the union made the fundamental decision to take all sectors into their union. The strike started with the inshore fleet on the Northern Peninsula. They went to the south coast to the trawler fleet to look for support. The trawlermen had an epic strike, which eventually led to a fundamental change in their situation. The financial assistance that made that situation possible was extended to the inshore fishermen who started the ball rolling in the first place. And that kind of squared the circle on that dispute. There's another man, and really I was struggled as to what to include, not to include in this presentation, because there's just so much material. But there is one item I'd be remiss not to touch on, even though I'll do so very briefly. In the mid to late 1970s, the northern shrimp stocks in the Davis Strait were expanding at quite a rate. And it became obvious that there was room to accommodate new entrants into that fishery. Richard Cashman was determined that not all the benefit go to the corporate sector, and that the inshore sector should benefit as well. They couldn't do so directly because the shrimp were at that time were far from shore and not accessible to the inshore fleet. But what he persuaded Romeo LeBlanc to do was to make 3 licenses available to the people of coastal Labrador. The union had recently gotten involved in the Straits of Labrador and the south coast, but were not involved in the north coast of Labrador. LeBlanc made a decision to award one license for the north coast, one for the south coast, and one for the Straits. Richard and Max Short organized a meeting in Labrador, a public meeting, to discuss how this would be dealt with. And the outcome of that was to set up what was effectively a cooperative, although it was formed as a company, but on a cooperative basis of one person, one vote. That organization is known as Labrador Fishermen's Union Shrimp Company. Every cent they realize in a year goes back into the company. There's no dividends paid to the shareholders. There's no accumulation of shares. All the benefit goes back into, when they say the company, effectively that means goes back into the communities. And it's been the absolute mainstay of the coast of Labrador from that day to this. And you could do a full presentation on that particular social enterprise and what a phenomenal difference it's made to the coastal Labrador, and how that's, as a issue, a matter of public policy, a great example of how to use a public resource for the common good. Now, the Burgeo strike and the trawler dispute were high-profile battles that really tested the union's mettle in the trawler and plant sections, respectively. The first time it was pushed to the wall in the inshore sector came in 1980. Negotiations for inshore prices went nowhere. And then the FFAW, the Fisheries Association of Newfoundland and Labrador, unilaterally announced fish prices that included a 4-cent cut in the price of crab and other reductions. And even more ominously, they announced out of the blue that they would cease deducting union dues. Well, that's a declaration of war. And the union announced selective picketing starting in 6 locations. The view being to test the solidarity of the companies. If some of their plants were shut and some weren't, then how were they going to respond to that? Well, the way they responded was they shut down all the FFAW plants, which, if I remember correctly, came to a total of 77 plants. And the ensuing strike and lockout went on for 5 weeks, but not before the premier that day, Brian Peckford, suggested pretty quickly early in that the parties agreed to a 30-day cooling off period. Well, in a brief seasonal summer fishery, the main thing that would have been cooled off would have been the union's bargaining power. So the union said no, thank you, all the same, and the strike ensued. For a while, fishery products thought they'd found a way of forcing some fish into the plant in St. Anthony. But when that failed, the dispute was settled within a few days. While the union was growing rapidly and establishing itself as a force to be reckoned with in the province, other developments were occurring which were to have a huge impact on the fishery in the province. Our northern cod stock had been fished at a peak in 1968 of 800,000 metric tons. 800,000 metric tons. 85% of it by foreign factory trawlers. A totally irresponsible and unsustainable level of harvest. Predictably, the catch rates declined, the stock declined, and by 1974, the inshore catch of northern cod, which had pretty consistently in the 50s been around 150 or so thousand tons, had dropped to less than a quarter of that. People left the fishery in droves. But despair, as it sometimes does, gave way to hope and optimism a couple of years later, when the government of Canada announced that it would be extending its exclusive economic zone to 200 miles from shore instead of 12. And that was seen as a way to get control of our fishery. Unfortunately, the unusual configuration of our continental shelf really worked against us. Most countries in the world, 200 miles was the accepted international exclusive zone at that time, and many countries adopted a 200-mile zone. For the vast majority of them, that encompassed their entire continental shelf. For a few, including Canada, or Canada's Atlantic coast, it didn't, because of these two aggravating little abutments called the nose and tail of the Grand Banks that extended beyond 200 miles and where fish, cod, flatfish, and turbot and others, oblivious as they were to the niceties of international laws, kind of swam back and forth and were pillaged by foreign fleets. Between 1988 and 1994, the European Union acknowledged fishing 5 times the allocations they got from the toothless fisheries management organization known as NAFO, although the Canadian enforcement authorities said 8 times would probably be more accurate. Either way, it was carnage on our stocks. Now, in the period leading up to that, there had been a period where inshore fishermen had said, passed on their observations about declining catches and smaller size of fish. But their comments were dismissed as anecdotal. And it was 1989 before federal scientists finally said whoops and acknowledged that they had made a grave overestimate. By then, stocks, which included northern cod, south coast cod, Gulf of St. Lawrence cod, and a variety of other groundfish species, were in serious decline. For a couple of years, the federal government tried to address the situation with half measures, but the shocking failure of the offshore trawler fleets northern cod fishery in the winter of 1992 confirmed what inshore harvesters have been saying all along. The fish were gone. So it was left to John Crosby to do the dirty work for Ottawa. He had been successful in getting only a minimal compensation program agreed to by his cabinet colleagues. And as he described in his autobiography, with a meager assistance package in hand, I set off for Newfoundland for the 1992 Canada Day weekend. After rough reception in Bay Bulls on Canada Day, he was scheduled to make a formal announcement on the evening of July 2nd. When he announced the closure of the northern cod fishery and weekly compensation of $225 for those who were displaced, all hell broke loose at the hotel where he made the announcement. He needed a police escort to get out of the building. Crosby later said, the pandemonium in St. John's was broadcast across the country. The televised outrage of Newfoundland fishermen had a profound effect on my colleagues in Ottawa. The next day, the union held a press conference at which Richard Cashin said, the union has rejected out of hand the government's compensation package. They have no right to set arbitrary figures. A few days later, the union bought a half hour of television time to lay out its response in more detail, at which time Richard said, we have advised both levels of government that if we are unable to negotiate a better arrangement, both as to the principles of the moratorium as well as the financial part, we will have to take measures to thwart what has been imposed upon us. The feds did not want this kind of confrontation. So Richard Cash and I were in Ottawa virtually nonstop over a 2-week period, meeting with federal officials to discuss what was needed in a proper program. The final package, known as NCARP, was arrived at in record time by Ottawa standards, and it provided 95% of an individual's employment insurance rate with a minimum of $225 a week and a maximum of $406. Other elements included early retirement, retraining, and a bare bones license buyback program. There were challenges, to be sure. The union was at a meeting when the Human Resources Department introduced a consultant who proposed to use the same approach we used in Brazil, working with peasants. Well, I don't know how their approach worked there, but we didn't feel it was going to work here. We did feel a massive communications program was required, and we felt it was best done by people who know and understand the fishery. We persuaded the federal government that that was the best way to proceed. In a 7-week time frame, the union organized 115, trained and organized 115 local discussion leaders who conducted 1,300 small group workshops involving 20,000 participants. The impact of the moratorium on the province was staggering. In the ensuing 10 years, the province's population dropped by a record 10%. After 2 years and a change of government, NCARP gave way to TAGS, the Atlantic Groundfish Strategy, which emphasized adjustment out of the fishery. The union again focused on union-driven, community-centered initiatives to help achieve the objectives of the program. Among other things, we worked with HRD to create Fishermen's Training Inc., which among other things funded regionally distributed adult education centers coordinated by the union and enabling people to upgrade their education to high school equivalent. Another entity, Deep Sea Training Inc., helped find work for displaced trawlmen in industries like offshore oil and gas and long distance trucking. A common element of these and other programs was the union's fundamental belief that the affected people and their union should have a central role in the design, coordination, and delivery of programs. Or to put it another way, notwithstanding Spencer Lake's views that we were very capable of running our own affairs. Now, the tags was initially scheduled for a 5-year duration, but the feds announced they'd be cutting it off after 4. So once again, the union was put to the test, and there was a major fight back program, which led to a $760 million post-tags funding, which included final cash payments, an early retirement option, licensed buyout program, and short-term job creation. Perhaps most important, what these various programs did was bridge the gap as valuable new fishing opportunities emerged. In the absence of cod, crab and shrimp populations blossomed, and crab became accessible much closer to shore than in the past. The union worked with small boat fleets and DFO to get access to the crab for smaller vessels, while at the same time campaigning hard and successfully to get access to the northern shrimp stocks for midshore vessels, which in turn resulted in work in a number of former groundfish plants that have been closed and were reopened as shrimp plants. These efforts were undertaken in the context of the federal owner, operator, and fleet separation policies that are really the link between coastal communities and adjacent fish resources. Despite the difficulties I've described, the fishery remains a major economic driver in about 400 coastal communities in our province. And when you think about it, what better way is there to distribute money to households and communities and the provincial economy than an increase in the price of fish and an increase in the wages in fish plants? There are any number of other matters I could touch on, and time is not our little friend here. Marketing alone, how we market our fish products, it could be a subject of a presentation in itself. Our history, which is not very good, of coordinating marketing. Probably the most successful example we've had in our history was NAFL, which was back in the 30s and 40s. You would think that we'd have been able to learn from that and maybe come up with something since, but we haven't. In 2005, the provincial government thought it was a good idea to implement a program in the crab of what they call raw material sharing, a plant production quota system in the crab fishery, which would have effectively been a massive shift of power from the fish harvesters to the crab producers. And that was met with absolutely fierce pushback, and eventually the government had to back off. And again, you could write a book on that. Don't think I will, but maybe somebody will. More recently, there was quite a pushback against the so-called LIFO policy in the shrimp fishery, last in, first out, which would have put an end to the midshore shrimp fishery and the northern shrimp. But the union, with great support from community leaders, was successful in pushing back on that. Now, I've touched on only a few highlights out of 50 years of struggle. In those years, the union has been confronted with market crashes, corporate restructuring, reorganizing the union itself, ongoing corporate campaigns to break the link between communities and adjacent resources, climate change, scandalous levels of foreign overfishing, and fish stock collapses that threatened the very survival of fishing communities and the union itself. One of the great strengths of the union over that time stemmed from the decision at the very beginning to create an industrial union that pulled everybody together in our coastal communities. And the unions, I guess, to conclude, the union's first 50 years have proven that rural Newfoundlanders and Labradorians can accomplish a great deal by sticking together and running their own affairs. Thank you very much. I can't hear, sorry.
Yeah, just one sec now. Oh, there. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much, Earl. That was a really interesting presentation, and you could tell from your voice just how committed you were for all those years. It's astounded me as to, you know, the amount of energy, not only from the leadership, but also from the members, both the inshore, offshore, and the plant workers, and how you're able to mobilize huge numbers of people for practically every endeavor that the union was engaged in. So it's a great pleasure to thank you for your presentation. I'm sure you all join me in thanking Earl for what he's put together. But the next step here, there's going to be an opportunity for questions and comments by using the raised hand method or by using the chat line. So we're just going to give the audience an opportunity to ask, either raise their hands or to ask a question or make a comment in the chat line.
Just if I could, John, just while people are thinking about that,
Yeah.
You raised a very good point. I mean, the union couldn't have even come close to succeeding on these many missions without tremendous rank and file support when that support was needed. If we put out the call, the people responded, and that was consistent throughout the 50 years. And you just can't you can't succeed without that. So I think that was absolutely critical on each one of those topics I touched on, and many more besides.
It seemed that almost every single year, almost without exception, there were some crises that arose, and it amazes me that the level of energy that the leadership was able to put in, yourself and Richard Cashin and others, you know, Chess Cribb and a whole range of other people involved in the leadership, but all the way down to the ordinary members of the union, and it's had a tremendous impact on the Newfoundland economy. So we have Steve Wallen that has raised his hand, and I think, Steve, you're free to talk now.
Okay, got a couple questions. One is, how hard was it to keep those three sectors of the union together? To put some meat on that, what strained the relationships the most? And the second is this odd structure where federal quotas set federally, fish plant allocations provincially. Was that an advantage or disadvantage? How would you redesign it if you had your druthers?
Well, somebody said essentially on the latter point first, essentially the jurisdiction in fish is that the federal government has jurisdiction over them when they're alive, and the provincial government when they're dead. And that's probably as you know, a succinct description as any. One of the difficulties and I saw there was recently a debate in the House of Assembly over you know, about having more, you know, it was joint management exactly they were debating, or more say, or something to that effect. And I certainly, you know, there's no question that and I think it's gotten worse actually, the federal government. My understanding is that they're more isolated and removed, and they've given less authority to their regional managers, who at least people can get access to, than say was the case when I was active. And I think that's that's very unfortunate. One of the challenges with respect to management of the fish in the water at a provincial level has to do with the stocks in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which some of those stocks, about on 5 provinces. So it would certainly be challenging as to how you would structure that to make decisions, because at some point someone has to make a decision on what's the quota going to be, what's the sub allocations within that quota, what are the licensing policies, and so on. I suppose you could conceivably have some kind of a board or something do it, but then what would be the basis for people being nominated to that board? So I guess all is to say it isn't easy as to how you go about doing that. It'd probably be more straightforward in those stocks that are only adjacent to a single province, such as most of our lobster resources, most of our crab resources, and the northern cod, I guess. Although I think the far north of that stock might be adjacent to Quebec, the very northern part of Quebec. But that's the challenge in that respect. On the first one, those various sectors exist in our fishery. The plant sector, the inshore sector, and the offshore sector. Certainly it would be possible to have multiple organizations. I would argue that each of those organizations would have less power. That they could probably get out and make famous pronouncements in the media and so on, aimed at their own particular membership. I'm not sure that brings you any closer to actually resolving the problems in question. What we found over the years was that if people have to actually get to know people in the other sectors, then that really helps trying to find a solution. If you actually have sat down across the table from them and got to know them on a personal level. By the way, some of the most difficult and intractable problems or conflicts as to resource allocations that I was involved with over the years were actually within the inshore sector, or the inshore and midshore sector. In other words, the non-corporate sector, where you had different interests, if you like. For example, how much of a particular resource would go to the midshore fleet, which would be, the longliner fleet is usually referred, how much to the smaller boats. And it was remarkable in my mind when the small boats really campaigned hard to get into the crab fishery, without which they would have had virtually nothing. That we were able to pull together committees representing the small boat fleets and committees representing the offshore, the traditional crab fleets from the bigger boats. By bigger, I mean the 35 to 65 foot fleet. And essentially there, the pitch we made was, these people have to live too. And, can we work something out here? And I would have to give full marks to the people in the traditional crab fleet, if I can put it that way, the ones who were in first, in that they're in terms of their willingness to accommodate these new winters, because there was more crab. That made it easier, to be sure. That crab had moved into the inshore waters where it hadn't been previously in any quantities, and in traditional areas traditionally fished by the smaller boats. And so we were able to work it out. Other times there were issues that weren't so easily worked out, where there was just conflicting interests between different inshore sectors. So that, the sharing. Somebody once said, a kind of a wise man once said, "There's the worst job in the world is shearing up fish," and I think he because he had to do some of that, and I think he was probably onto something, because it is a very, very tough job.
Okay, Leah, I noticed that there's 3 or 4 chat line comments or questions. Could you talk about those?
Yeah, so Bill Gillespie asks, there is constant talk via the media that unions have become too powerful. What is your response to that?
Well, there certainly seems to be fairly frequent talk. Last time I looked, the corporations weren't doing too badly. If you look at profit margins, and if you look at how they've been doing in the economy generally, so I don't know. I'm not exactly sure who that comes from. Certainly the media. There's been a concentration in the media. There used to one time, for example, be actually such a thing as labor beat reporters. I was one myself back in the day with the Telegram, and so that point of view came out or at least the issues involving the labor movement were covered. Given coverage to both the corporate and the labor point of view, but nonetheless, they were reported much more than is the case today. I don't think there's any evidence, certainly none that I've been able to detect, that the corporate sector is suffering. Matter of fact, I think there's probably as much need for unions, if not more, today than there ever was.
Okay, Leah, how about another chat line comment?
Yeah, Joan Hodson says, excellent information. My father was a small boat inshore fisherman at the Battery, making a cent and a half a pound for cod. Pre-200-mile limit, I remember some fishers selling to Russian vessels for more. Did not the federal government fail to protect the fishery early enough? Could you please comment on relations with the maritime provinces?
There's a couple of points there I'd like to touch on. One on the, and there's no question that the prices, the pre-union prices were dismally low, and there was years thereafter when it was a struggle to get prices because the market kind of ebbed and flowed, and it was always a battle to get an acceptable price. On the selling to foreign boats, that was something that the union undertook, starting in about, I think it was 1978. I might be off by a year, when there was abundant supplies of squid and mackerel and no market, and we were able to locate a Bulgarian buyer who had a few ships who could come in and buy through what was known as over-the-side sales. And you get these little boats lined off, tied one to the other, lined off beside this large factory trawler, and their catch was hoisted up over the side, and the union put weighmasters on board to keep tabs on landings. And the union actually was the buyer for the purpose of the transaction, and the Bulgarian company would pay for the bulk of the landings, and then the individual checks and so on were sent by issued by the union from their office. That extended to overflow situations in the cod fishery, and subsequently turbot. when there was, and certainly in the area of the battery, there was times that's an area where there's the battery and the east end of St. John's and the southern shore, which had a very prolific cod trap fishery. And a cod trap is a gear type that can catch a tremendous amount of fish in a short period of time at the right time of year. And there was just more fish around than the plants could handle. And so the union eventually, was successful in getting that. There was a kind of an interesting story. If I can deviate just for a second, we were unsuccessful in getting approval from the provincial government to have a license to buy surplus cod, because the companies were very much against it. They fought tooth and nail against it. And so I called into the open line show or shows at the time and said, anyone, especially seniors in town, who wants a meal of fish, come down to Atlantic Place. And we had small boat fishermen with pickup loads of fish who were giving away their surplus catch rather than have it go to waste. It made the national news that night, and the next day we had approval for for a license to bring in the I think it was a Russian vessel at that time to catch the surplus. Now, they weren't allowed to catch to take priority over the plants. It was only after the plants were fully accommodated that these vessels could take fish. But there was, it wasn't unusual for there to be far more fish available than the plants could possibly choke down. With respect to the Maritimes, we had a kind of the organizations there, the fishing organizations. There tends to be a number of, at least there was in my day, and I think it's still the case, relatively small or regional type associations. They did have a federation of associations going for a number of years. The biggest organization was the Maritime Fishermen's Union. But there was a multiplicity of organizations there. We had good relationships with them. We created a kind of an association or a federation that we worked together on issues of common concern, and so on. And as far as I know, that's still, some of those efforts are still continuing.
Leah, can we go to Morley Knight? He's had his hand up for a
Sure.
while. We'll get back to the chat line.
Okay.
Can you?
Yeah, Morley, you can ask your question.
All right. Thank you very much. Hello, Earl. Very good rendition of history, I think. I think over the 50 years, you certainly covered the high points. And I have to tell you that I started to feel tired as you started to go through many of these things, because I lived through about 40 years of those things. Some of the hard stuff.
Morley, your audio is fading a bit. So can you make sure you're closer to the microphone part of your computer?
Okay, I'm going to turn off my video. That might help. Earl, I had a couple of questions for you. One was what you've been alluding to recently about the Maritimes, and I wondered what you thought. You've kind of touched on this, but in comparison to the other Atlantic provinces, where there's no real comparable organization as to the union in this province, how do you think they have fared in terms of their overall contribution to the communities and the contribution of the fishery? The second thing I'd certainly like your views on is the owner-operator process and principle. And you and I would have agreed over the years that was a fundamental tenet to the survival of the inshore fishery and coastal communities. But given the decline now, I'm wondering if we've actually may have won some battles but lost the war in some of that aspect. So I certainly like your current view on that. Thank you.
I'll just start with the one on the Maritimes. I'm slightly averse to trying and to sort of compare our you know, how we fared to the maritime organizations, in that they had their own way of doing things, their own circumstances, and their you know, their own structures and so on. We certainly had a good you know, cordial relationships with most of those groups, and I'd sort of be inclined to leave it at that, and just you know, stand by kind of our accomplishments. On the owner operator, there's no question that's been a real battle. There's really two policies, and the one you hear less about, but probably has at least historically had the most important teeth, was the kind of sister policy, that fleet separation policy, which was brought into effect by Romeo LeBlanc when he was Minister of Fisheries and Oceans in, I'll say, 1979, give or take a year. And the effect, basically the core of that, the guts of it, was that inshore fishing licenses, which were defined, I think, as under 65 feet licenses at the time, maybe subject to correction on the detail there, could only be held by inshore fish harvesters, not by corporations. In other words, that you couldn't have vertical integration as relates to the inshore fleet. The corporations were entitled to own the larger vessels, you know, the offshore trawlers. The owner-operator policy came in a number of years later when Tom Sidden was minister, and it basically, you know, required that the owner of a license personally operate the license. I think that one has perhaps been honored a little in the breach, or perhaps it's been subject to interpretation as to whether, I suppose there's a fair argument that someone says, well, I'm running the enterprise and not necessarily on board the boat all the time, but there's a lot of business associated with the enterprise, quite apart from the catching of the fish. In any event, those two are were kind of those two pieces of legislation were kind of the Bobbsey twins. The fish plant operators have been coming up with a succession of ways to try and get around that, to break down those policies, because they'd like to be able to get control over those licenses and the quotas of fish that go with them. The efforts were made to tighten up the policy first through regulation and then through legislation. There was a test case that went through court involving a license, at least nominally held by an individual in Labrador, that DFO prevailed in. But best I can tell, and I've been out of the industry now for 8 years, the processors keep coming up with new constructs as to how they might get around the intent, the initial intent of the legislation, and it's kind of an uphill battle to keep it in place as initially intended.
Now, can we have one more from the chat line, and then we'll go to Terry Mackey, who's got his hand up.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Anthony Berger asks, what do you see ahead for the Newfoundland fisheries in an era of warming, more acidic oceans, and changes in the location of many fish species?
Well, boy, that's a challenging one. The people who thought they could answer that question in the 80s really proved to be wrong. So it's hard to know, but there's no question that factors like ocean, climatic factors, water temperatures in particular, but also presence of predators, presence of food, the presence of phytoplankton, and so on, are critical to the survival of key fisheries. And these fisheries can migrate. Sometimes they migrate further north. We saw with lobster, where the population of lobster in Maine, which was a huge lobster producing area, diminished significantly. And in that particular situation, we were the beneficiary because of ourselves in the Maritimes, because the lobster became more abundant in our waters and less so in the waters in Maine. What exactly it means, I would have thought, for instance, that by now if someone asked me to speculate on that, asked me 5 years ago, that the crab stocks would be probably struggling right now, and by all accounts they're still doing well. And all the people I talked to in my travels and asking, our crab fishers ask how they're doing, reported to me that the abundance seems still very good. And there's a bit of a scare there a couple of years ago, and maybe 3 years ago, and it proved to be a false alarm. So it's a bit of a mug's game, because I just don't know. But clearly, when you have the kind of change that's happening in the climate, I think all bets are off as to what that means for different species, because some are cold water species and some are warm water. I mean, in the 90s, because the water temperatures got so cold, that's one of the factors, I think. I think overfishing was a primary one, but the cod stocks going so low, water temperatures probably one of the factors. At the same time, crab and shrimp like cold water, and they blossom. But if that's the case, how come the crab is doing so well now? So it's I guess my conclusion would be that the ocean is a mysterious place. I figured that out some time ago, and I don't think I particularly have the answer to that mystery.
Okay,
Okay, and Terry McKay has his hand up.
Yes, he does. Can you unmute him, please?
He can unmute himself.
All right, Terry, can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Yes.
Go ahead, Terry.
Well, in all the conversations I've had with you over 30 odd years, one of the things that struck me is that the unions be more aggressive on marketing than the employers. That, I'm not underestimating the role of the merchants in their power. If you live in Harbour Grace like we did for the summers, it's clear to you. But when I look at the markets in Asia, in Korea, in Japan, and Thailand and elsewhere, it seems to me that the owners have missed an opportunity, and also in Europe. And why is it that your members and your leadership has been more aggressive on marketing than the so-called business class?
Well, that's a mystery, but it's certainly I think a critical question. I mean, I mentioned briefly NAFL, which I think stands for something like, I think it's the Newfoundland Association of Fish Exporters Limited.
That's right.
And that was introduced back in sometime in, I think, the 30s and went on into the 40s. And it was designed for the purpose of trying to get some order in the how we market salt fish, so that we would to try and get away from cutthroat pricing as between different Newfoundland companies selling into the various markets. And my understanding is that for most of its life, NAFL was successful. Now, it was only as good as the, and I'm far from an expert on NAFL, but it wasn't actually legislated that everybody would sell through NAFL. But it was, I think it was, the NAFL was fairly widely supported at the time. and seen as probably the best bet we had to avoid the kind of cutthroat pricing that had been so damaging. Since then, not so much. The Canadian Salt Fish Corporation was an attempt by the federal government to help with the marketing of salt fish, and it had a little run for a while. I was personally present at a meeting when Fishery Products, first of all, put it this way, Fishery Products International was really, when it was put together as a creature of public policy, it was the two levels of government really were the ones who put together FPI in the 80s. And it was kind of seen as a flagship company, particularly with respect to the marketing of products. And part of their mandate was to offer to market products on behalf of other companies. But when FPI broke up, it was a hostile takeover basically at a shareholders meeting. Eventually the new crowd got tired of it, and they decided to sell, balkanize the company and sell the parts. One of the parts was the so-called marketing arm. The premier at the time was Danny Williams, and he called various key industry people into a meeting in his boardroom. I was one of them, and there was a number of company representatives. And he said, look, my gut tells me that it'd be a real mistake for us to lose control over the FPI marketing arm. It's just too important for our industry. We need that kind of strength and that kind of coordination. And I'm willing to put money into it. If I don't want to be operating, so I don't want to be selling fish, but if you fellows are willing to operate it, then I'm willing. He's good as said, we're willing to pay for it. If you guys would operate. And one by one, they said, "No, that's okay, thanks." And he couldn't believe that. In fact, I was only halfway back to my office, and my phone rang in the car, cell phone rang, and it was Premier, and he had to call somebody. He was so frustrated, and because we weren't exactly buddies, and anyway, that wouldn't fly. I'd say maybe a few years later, some will remember the famous or infamous MOU fiasco, but in any event, the union was again pushing for coordinated marketing. That's the one area where the province actually listened to what we said, and they offered to put $5 million into a provincial fish marketing council, but only if it was supported by the plants. And they'd have to, the terms of the offer was that they'd have to take a vote, and if a majority voted to accept it, then the money was there. And by the way, similar councils are in place in Iceland and Alaska, and I'm pretty sure Norway. That's quite a common a way to coordinate sales from a or promotion or both from a particular jurisdiction. And once again, they turned it down. So it's $5 million to help come up with it. Now, they weren't even dictating how it be used. They were just saying, there's the money that could be used for advertising. It could be used for whatever purposes the industry wanted to put it to, I guess, within reason. And again, they turned it down, and they had what a mark, and so we were left with what our marketing consultant, the guy who used to be used in collective bargaining to give us marketing updates, described in the crab fishery as the Friday night frenzy, where companies would have to unload product on a Friday so that they'd have cash flow by Monday to pay for their raw material purchases the following week. And that's the kind of disorder that I think we should have found a way to get past. And it has been frustrating because I think from day one, virtually the union has been pushing that as being something that is just in everybody's interest. We're not saying that too because it's an advantage. We weren't saying it because it's an advantage for the union vis-a-vis the processors, but that it was in the interest of our overall industry, so that we would increase the pie, and then we could have a bigger pie to decide how we're gonna split up.
Okay.
Can we have
And
another-
Joan Hodson has a question. She says, how would you rate the federal government's commitment to the industry?
I think it has varied somewhat from time to time. A lot has depended on who the minister was at a given time. As best I can tell, in recent years, is hopeless. And I'm not, this is kind of secondhand information. I'm not involved myself. I do, come across people from time to time, not only, representatives of the union, but people in, current or former DFO people and so on. And at one point, the federal bureaucracy, and sometimes the minister, depending on who it was, gave a fair bit of weight to what the people in the regions had to say about, key decisions, on the basis that they were the ones closest to the ground. They were the ones who would meet people in the industry. They were the ones who, understood, the finer details of these problems that were being dealt with. I understand now that there's virtually none of that. That the not only to that the provincial managers, have very little authority. They just, push it all up to Ottawa, and that fish, in fact, is not very big priority in the federal department, whatever it's now called. Just seems to have. So it certainly, there was times years ago, there were ups and downs. It was, I suppose, never. You might argue that it was never great, but it seems to have gotten worse, not better.
Leah, another chat line.
Yep. And last question is from Stephen Wolinetz, who says, how would you describe your relationship with Derek Butler?
Well, I don't want to get personal or take any cheap shots. I mean, Derek and I dealt with each other across the table and for quite a few years, and he had a job to do and I had a job to do, and I guess we didn't always see eye to eye, but then you probably wouldn't expect to. I don't envy him his job. I mean, sometimes what he's got to do is a bit like herding cats, and I suppose what I had to do when I was at it was a bit like herding cats. So we got along with each other, I guess, as best we could, and I'll probably let it go at that.
Okay, and Brian Miller just popped a question in asking, didn't we have a marketing problem this past crab season, too much quota and limited market?
Yes, I think what happened this past year was really kind of came out of thin air. Going into it was completely unexpected going into the year. The announcement that the crab quota in Alaska was going to be dramatically reduced, and Alaska being our main competitor in the crab marketplace, that plus the restrictions on Russian product brought in by the Biden administration, Russia being another supplier of crab, seemed to create quite an opportunity for us in 2022. That's how it looked right up until the point when price negotiations took place in around the end of March. And But gradually what happened, the companies bought and product didn't move, and it did move, and it did move, not in any significant volumes. It was very unusual. Normally there's a point where you might have a little bit of a backlog, and then they hit what's referred to as a clearing price, where there's a kind of a balance struck between the demands of the seller and the desires of the buyer, and the exporter and the importer, that is, and a price is worked out and product starts to move. But unusually this year, the market just seized up, even though Alaska wasn't providing anything, and the Russians' production was very limited. It wasn't just a Newfoundland problem. The Gulf of St. Lawrence had the same problem. And the market, I guess what happened, or a factor may have been that the price got so high last fall and in the winter, which I think was driven by some of the traders down in the U.S. who got product and really saw an opportunity to milk the situation, and it just got to the point where people said, well, that's too expensive, I'm not paying. And then once that kind of psychology sets in, it can be tough to turn around. So the market, the price, to the extent there were any sales, which there weren't a lot, the notional price kept dropping, and it only finally leveled off and inched back up in the last few weeks. So whether product will now start to move and clear out before next season, I guess is the I'm going to say $1 million question, but it's closer to being $1 billion question. And certainly it would be a bad situation if a large portion of that amount of crab was still in inventory at the time that we were about to fish our next year's crab fishery.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Earl. I think that's will draw the evening to a close. It's been really a great presentation and some very challenging questions